The stagecoach from Cheyenne rattled over the last mile of frozen road, and Myrtle Carter pressed her palm against the wooden crate on the seat beside her, as though it might fly away if she let go for even a moment. Inside that crate sat her mother's loom, disassembled into careful pieces wrapped in wool blankets, and it was the only thing left in this world that still smelled like home. The year was 1876, and the Wyoming territory stretched out beyond the coach window in every direction, white and merciless under a January sky the color of tin. Myrtle was 22 years old, and she had buried her mother only 6 weeks prior, back in Missouri, where the ground had been soft enough to dig a grave without breaking pickaxes on frost. Here in this high country, she understood now, a person could die of cold before they died of grief, and grief was proving to be the slower of the two. She had come west because there was nothing left for her in Missouri. Her father had passed when she was a girl of 16, taken by a fever that swept through their county, and her mother had raised her alone in the years since, teaching her every thread and knot of the weaver's trade. When her mother's heart gave out on a Tuesday morning while she sat at her loom, Myrtle had been left with a small inheritance, a trunk of clothes and the loom itself, which her mother had carried all the way from Kentucky as a young bride. There was a cousin of her mother's who had written to say there was work for a seamstress in a town called Larkspur Hollow, nestled against the Bighorn Mountains, and Myrtle had taken that as sign enough. She had nowhere else to be, and a woman alone needed somewhere to be. The coach driver, a leathery man named Otis who had not said more than 10 words the entire journey, finally called out that they were coming up on Larkspur Hollow, and Myrtle felt her stomach tighten with something between hope and dread. The town, when it appeared, was smaller than she had imagined. A single wide street lined with false-fronted buildings, a livery, a mercantile, a saloon with its windows fogged from the heat inside, and a small white church with a steeple that leaned slightly to the east, as though it had been built by a man who was in a hurry to get back to something else. Smoke rose from a dozen chimneys, and the air smelled of pine and wood smoke and the particular sharpness of a mountain winter. The coach stopped in front of the mercantile, and Otis climbed down to help her with her trunk. The crate with the loom was heavier, and it took the both of them, grunting and careful, to set it down on the boardwalk. "You expecting someone, miss?" Otis asked, wiping his brow despite the cold. "My mother's cousin was to arrange lodging," Myrtle said, though even as she spoke the words she felt a creeping unease. The letter had been vague on details, and now, standing in the actual dust and snow of the actual town, she realized she had crossed half a country on the strength of a single letter from a woman she had never met. She went into the mercantile, where a heavy-set woman with spectacles perched on her nose looked up from behind the counter. "I'm looking for a woman named Adeline Foss," Myrtle said. "She's my mother's cousin. She wrote to me about lodging and work here in Larkspur Hollow." The woman's face fell into an expression of practiced sympathy, the kind reserved for delivering bad news to strangers. "Oh, honey, Adeline Foss passed on back in November. Pneumonia took her quick. I'm sorry you came all this way not knowing." Myrtle felt the floor tilt beneath her, though she knew it was only her own legs threatening to give out. She had crossed half the country on a dead woman's promise. "I don't suppose you know of anywhere I might find a room," she managed to say, though her voice sounded strange and distant to her own ears. The shopkeeper, whose name turned out to be Mrs. Prout, shook her head slowly. "There's the boarding house, but Widow Halloran filled her last room just this week to a family passing through to the gold camps. Everything else in town is spoken for, what with winter driving folks in off the range." Myrtle stood there in the warmth of the mercantile with snow melting off her boots, and for the first time since her mother's death, she felt truly and completely alone. It was at that moment that the bell above the door jangled, and a gust of frigid air swept in ahead of a man so large he seemed to fill the doorway entirely. Henry Bass stood well over 6 feet, with shoulders built wide from years of felling timber and shoulders that stretched the seams of his heavy wool coat. His hair was dark, and a little too long for fashion, curling out from beneath his hat and brushing his collar, and a close beard covered a jaw that looked like it had been carved rather than grown. His hands, when he pulled off his gloves to greet Mrs. Prout, were scarred and calloused, the hands of a man who worked timber and stone with his own strength rather than hired help. "Afternoon, Mrs. Prout," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to match the mountains he'd clearly spent his life among. "I'm needing more nails if you've got them, and some coffee if the supply wagon came through." "Got both, Henry," Mrs. Prout said, and then, seeming to remember Myrtle standing there, she added, "This young lady's in a spot of trouble. Come all this way to stay with her mother's cousin, only her cousin passed on before she arrived. No room to be had anywhere in town." Henry Bass turned to look at Myrtle properly for the first time, and she felt his gaze move over her the way a man might survey whether he didn't entirely trust. She was aware, suddenly, of how she must look after days of travel, her dress rumpled, her dark hair escaping its pins, her face pale with grief and cold. But there was nothing unkind in his expression, only a kind of careful assessment, as though he were deciding what to do about a problem that had been placed in his path. "Where were you headed to sleep tonight, miss?" he asked. "I hadn't thought that far," Myrtle admitted, and hated how small her voice sounded. Henry rubbed a hand over his jaw, considering. "I've got a cabin up the mountain about 4 miles out. It's got a spare room, used to be for my mother before she passed, God rest her. It's clean and it's got a door that locks from the inside. You'd be safe there, and it beats sleeping in the church pews, which is about the only other offer you're likely to get tonight." Mrs. Prout nodded along as though this were the most natural solution in the world, and Myrtle supposed that out here, in a town this small, it might well be. "Henry's a good man, dear. Built half the sturdy structures in this town himself. You'll be safe with him, I promise you that." Myrtle hesitated, every instinct bred into her by a careful upbringing telling her that a woman did not simply go off to a strange man's cabin in the mountains. But the alternative was the cold, uncaring street, and the crate holding her mother's loom sitting forlornly on the boardwalk outside, and she found herself nodding before she had fully decided to. "I would be grateful," she said. "Truly grateful, Mr. Bass." "Henry," he corrected gently. "Mr. Bass makes me sound like my father, and he wasn't a man I care to be reminded of." He glanced toward the door. "You got baggage." "A trunk," she said, "and a crate. It's my mother's loom. She's passed, and it's all I have left of her, so I'd ask you to be careful with it." Something shifted in Henry's expression then, a flicker of understanding that told Myrtle he knew something of loss himself. "I'll treat it like it's made of glass," he said simply, and went to fetch his wagon. The ride up into the mountains took the better part of an hour, the wagon creaking over a trail that grew steeper and more narrow with every mile, snow-laden pines pressing close on either side like sentinels. Myrtle sat wrapped in a blanket Henry had produced from beneath the wagon seat, watching her breath fog in the cold air, stealing glances at the man beside her. He drove with an easy competence, his big hands loose on the reins, occasionally murmuring low words to the horses that seemed more comfort than command. He did not attempt conversation, and she was grateful for that, for she did not think she had words left in her for pleasantries. But the silence between them did not feel empty. It felt, strangely, like the kind of quiet that came from two people who understood, without needing to say it, that words were not always necessary. "You lost your mother too," Myrtle said finally, breaking the stillness. "Mrs. Prout said something, and you said something about your father." Henry's jaw tightened briefly. "My mother's been gone 3 years now. Consumption. My father left when I was young, never much cared for mountain life or the work it demanded. It's been me alone up here since." "I'm sorry," Myrtle said, and meant it. "I'm sorry for your loss too," Henry said. "A person doesn't cross the whole country carrying their mother's loom unless that loom means something more than wood and string." Myrtle looked down at her hands, folded in her lap. "She taught me everything I know at that loom. It was how she made her living after my father died, weaving blankets and cloth to sell. I thought, if I could bring it west with me, I could do the same. Build a life from what she taught me. It seemed foolish the moment I stepped off that coach and found there was no one waiting for me. It's not foolish, Henry said, and there was a firmness in his voice that surprised her. A trade's a trade, and a good weaver's cloth sells well out here, where everything has to be freighted in or made by hand. You'll find work for those skills, Miss Carter. I'd wager on it. They arrived at the cabin as the light was failing, the sky bruising purple and gray above the black silhouette of the mountains. The cabin itself was larger than Myrtle had expected, built of thick-hewn logs with a stone chimney rising from one end, smoke already curling faintly from the flue where the morning's fire had banked down to embers. A lean-to stable stood off to one side, and beyond that, the dark tree line climbed up toward peaks she could not fully see in the dimming light. Henry helped her down from the wagon, his hand closing around hers with a gentleness that seemed almost at odds with the sheer size and strength of him. And then he carried the crate with her mother's loom into the cabin as carefully as he had promised, setting it down near the hearth as though it were an altar. The inside of the cabin was simple but well kept. A single main room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a narrow bed in one corner covered with furs, and a doorway leading to what Myrtle assumed was the spare room he had mentioned. Everything smelled of pine smoke and leather, and something else she could not quite name, something that she would later come to understand was simply the smell of Henry Bass himself, of a man who lived close to the earth and worked with his hands. "It's not much," Henry said, almost apologetically, as he stirred the fire back to life. "But it's warm and it's yours for as long as you need it." "It's more than I had an hour ago," Myrtle said, and found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like weeks. That night, after a simple supper of beans and salt pork that Henry prepared without complaint, Myrtle lay in the narrow spare-room bed and listened to the wind moving through the pines outside, and for the first time since her mother's death, she did not cry herself to sleep. She thought instead of the strange, quiet strength of the man in the next room, and wondered what tomorrow might bring. Morning came with a light that Myrtle had never seen before, pale gold spilling through frost-laced windows, catching on the crystals that had formed overnight along the edges of the glass. She woke to the sound of an axe splitting wood outside, a steady rhythmic thud that spoke of a man already hours into his day, while she had only just opened her eyes. She dressed quickly in the cold room and made her way out to find Henry in the yard, stripped down to his shirt sleeves despite the frigid morning, his axe rising and falling with a practiced economy of motion that spoke of years of labor. She watched for a moment unnoticed as his muscles worked beneath the fabric of his shirt, the sheer physical power of him somehow both intimidating and, she admitted to herself with a small flush of embarrassment, undeniably compelling. "Morning," he said, catching sight of her before she could retreat. He set the axe down and wiped his brow with his forearm. "Sleep all right." "Better than I expected," Myrtle admitted. "Thank you again, Henry, for everything." "No need for thanks," he said, though he looked pleased nonetheless. "I've got coffee on inside, and there's biscuits I made this morning, though I'll warn you my mother would have been ashamed of how they turned out." Over breakfast, seated at the rough table with the fire crackling nearby, Myrtle found herself studying the cabin more closely in the daylight. It was sturdily built, every joint fitted with obvious care, and she commented on it. "Built it myself," Henry said, not without pride. "Took me the better part of 2 years, working when I wasn't out timbering for the mill in town or trapping through the winters. A man builds his own home right, or he doesn't build it at all." "You must be skilled with your hands," Myrtle said, and then flushed slightly at how the words sounded, though Henry only nodded, apparently taking the comment at its plainest meaning. "I do what needs doing," he said simply. "What about you? What will you do now with your cousin gone?" Myrtle considered the question seriously for the first time since the shock of yesterday had begun to fade. "I suppose I'll need to find work and lodging of my own eventually. I can't impose on your kindness forever." "You're not imposing," Henry said, quicker than she expected. But I understand you'd want your own place, your own way of doing things. There's no shame in that." They spent the morning discussing possibilities, and Henry, it turned out, knew the town and its people well, having lived in its shadow his entire life. He mentioned that the town's only seamstress, an elderly widow named Constance Ridley, had been struggling to keep up with mending and dress orders on her own, and that Myrtle's skills might find welcome there. "I could take you down to town this afternoon, introduce you around," Henry offered. "Widow Ridley's a fair woman. She might take you on, especially once she sees what you can do at that loom of yours." Myrtle's chest tightened at the mention of the loom. "I haven't even set it up yet. It's been in pieces since Missouri." "Well," Henry said, glancing toward the crate still sitting near the hearth, "there's room enough here if you wanted to assemble it. Not much use carrying a thing that far only to leave it boxed up forever." And so it was that Myrtle spent that first full day in the Wyoming mountains carefully unpacking her mother's loom, piece by piece, with Henry's help fitting the larger beams together according to her careful instruction. It was strange, she thought, to be guiding those enormous, capable hands through such delicate work, watching him handle each carved wooden piece with a tenderness that seemed to surprise even himself. "My mother used to say a loom was like a marriage," Myrtle said as they worked, threading the warp beam into place. "Every piece has to trust every other piece, or the whole thing falls apart when you put strain on it." Henry paused, considering this with the same careful attention he seemed to give everything. "Sounds about right," he said. "Same as building a cabin. Every log's got to bear its share, or the roof comes down on you eventually." By evening, the loom stood assembled in the corner of the main room, its frame rising nearly to the ceiling, and Myrtle ran her hands over the familiar wood with an ache in her throat that was equal parts grief and gratitude. It was the first time since her mother's death that she had touched the loom and felt something other than loss. She felt instead a kind of continuation, as though her mother's hands were somehow present in her own as she traced the grain of the wood. "Thank you," she said softly, not trusting her voice to carry more than that. Henry, standing behind her, said nothing for a long moment, and when she turned to look at him, she found his eyes fixed not on the loom but on her, with an expression she could not quite name but that made her pulse quicken in a way she had not expected. "It's a fine piece of work," he said finally, his voice rougher than usual. "Your mother must have been skilled indeed." "She was the finest weaver in our county," Myrtle said. "I only hope I can do half as well." "I suspect you'll do just fine," Henry said, and there was something in the way he said it, some quiet certainty, that made Myrtle believe him despite herself. The following days settled into an easy rhythm that surprised Myrtle with how naturally it came. Henry would rise before dawn to see to the horses and split wood, and Myrtle would wake to find breakfast already started, coffee brewing on the stove. In the afternoons, Henry took her into town, where introductions were made, and Widow Ridley, a sharp-eyed woman with silver hair pulled into a tight bun, examined a sample of Myrtle's weaving with obvious approval. "This is fine work," Constance Ridley said, running her fingers over the tight, even weave of the cloth Myrtle had brought as demonstration. "Where did you learn such craft?" "My mother taught me," Myrtle said. "She wove for our whole county back in Missouri." "Well, your mother taught you well. I'll take what blankets and cloth you can produce and pay fair rates for them. Lord knows this town needs good wool cloth, what with winters like we get up here." The widow's eyes flicked toward Henry, who stood near the doorway with his hat in his hands, waiting patiently. "And I see you've found good lodging already." "Mr. Bass has been more than generous," Myrtle said. "Henry's always been a soft touch for anyone in need," Constance said, not unkindly. "His mother raised him right, God rest her soul, though I'll say it's not often he brings a young woman up to that cabin of his." Myrtle felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she was not entirely sure why the comment should affect her so. "It was a matter of necessity, ma'am, nothing more." "Of course, dear," Constance said, though her knowing smile suggested she was not entirely convinced, and Myrtle found herself avoiding Henry's eyes for the rest of the walk back to the wagon. But despite her protests to Constance Ridley, Myrtle found that the days at the cabin were beginning to feel less like an arrangement of necessity and more like something else entirely. Something she did not yet have a name for, but that warmed her chest whenever Henry entered a room, whenever his low voice rumbled through some observation about the weather or the work he'd done that day. She began weaving in earnest during those weeks, filling the cabin with the steady, rhythmic clack of the loom's shuttle, the whisper of thread passing through warp. Henry, when he was not out working, would often sit near the fire whittling small figures from scrap wood, and the two of them would work in companionable silence for hours, occasionally breaking to share some observation or story from their pasts. It was during one such evening, perhaps 3 weeks into her stay, that Myrtle first noticed the careful way Henry watched her hands move across the loom, the shuttle passing back and forth with practiced ease. "You make it look easy," he said. "I tried my hand at basket weaving once when I was young, nearly took my fingers off with the reeds." Myrtle laughed, a genuine laugh that surprised her with how easily it came. "It's not so different from carpentry, I'd think. Everything has its place, its proper tension. You just have to learn to feel it." "Maybe you could teach me sometime," Henry said, and though his tone was light, there was something underneath it that made Myrtle's breath catch. "I'd like that," she said softly, and meant it more than she expected to. It was around this time that Myrtle began to realize the spare room, comfortable as it was, had never truly been built with weaving in mind. The loom took up considerable space, crowding the small room until she had barely enough space to move around it, and the light through the single window was poor for the fine work of checking her weave for flaws. She said nothing of this to Henry, not wanting to seem ungrateful for all he had already given her, but he noticed anyway, as he seemed to notice most things about her that she tried to keep hidden. "You're cramped in there," he said one evening, nodding toward the spare room where the loom's frame was visible through the open door, pressed close against the walls. "A weaver needs proper light and proper space. That room was built for sleeping, not working." "I manage well enough," Myrtle said, though she could not quite keep the weariness from her voice, for she had spent the better part of that day squeezed between the loom and the wall, straining her eyes in the dim afternoon light to catch a flaw in her weave. Henry was quiet for a long moment, studying the fire with an expression Myrtle had come to recognize as the look he wore when he was turning some plan over in his mind, weighing its practicalities the way he might weigh the soundness of a felled tree before deciding how to cut it. "I could build you a proper room," he said finally. "Off the side of the cabin. Big windows, good light, space enough for the loom and a chair besides. Wouldn't take more than a few weeks if the weather holds." Myrtle stared at him, startled by the offer. "Henry, you've already done so much for me. I couldn't ask you to build an entire room." "You're not asking," Henry said simply. "I'm offering. There's a difference." He looked at her then, his dark eyes steady in the firelight. "Besides, a woman who weaves the way you do deserves a proper place to do it in, not some cramped corner she has to fight for elbow room in." Myrtle felt something warm bloom in her chest at his words, something that went beyond simple gratitude. "Why would you do this for me, Henry? You barely knew me a month ago." Henry considered the question seriously, as he seemed to consider everything. "I suppose," he said slowly, "it's because watching you work that loom is the first thing that's made this cabin feel like more than just a place I sleep in since my mother passed. It's felt like a home again, having you here. I'd like to see that continue if you're willing." The words hung in the air between them, heavier than either of them had perhaps intended, and Myrtle found herself unable to look away from him, from the earnest vulnerability in his expression that seemed so at odds with his massive frame and rough hands. "I'd like that too," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. And so the building began. Henry spent his mornings felling additional timber, and his afternoons, when weather permitted, working on the new room that would extend from the cabin's south-facing wall, where the light would be best throughout the day. Myrtle watched from the doorway sometimes, marveling at the ease with which he handled logs that she could not have moved an inch on her own, the sheer physical competence of him as he notched and fitted each piece with careful precision. "You've done this before," she observed one afternoon, watching him set a window frame into place with practiced hands. "This whole cabin with these same two hands," Henry said, not looking up from his work. "A man learns to do for himself out here or he doesn't survive the winters." "It must have been lonely," Myrtle said, "building all of this alone after your mother passed." Henry paused then, setting down his hammer to look at her properly. "It was," he admitted. "Lonelier than I let myself think about most days. A man gets used to quiet, tells himself he doesn't need anything more than what he's got. But then someone comes along and reminds him what it felt like to have another voice in the house, and he realizes how much he'd been missing without knowing it." Myrtle's heart pounded at the weight of his words, at the way he looked at her as he said them, and she found herself stepping closer without quite deciding to, drawn by something she could not name but felt with her whole body. "Henry," she started, but he shook his head gently. "I don't mean to rush you," he said. "I know it's not been long since you lost your mother, and grief's got its own timeline that doesn't care much for a man's feelings. I just wanted you to know is all. Wanted you to know what your being here has meant to me." "It's meant something to me too," Myrtle said softly, "more than I think I've let myself admit." They stood there for a long moment in the cold afternoon air, close enough that Myrtle could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the winter chill, and she thought, not for the first time, how easy it would be to close the remaining distance between them. But Henry, ever careful, ever considerate of her feelings, stepped back first, clearing his throat. "I should get back to work," he said, "before the light goes." Myrtle nodded, though she found herself watching him for a long moment after he turned back to his task, her heart still racing from the near closeness of him. The weaving room took shape over the following weeks with a speed that surprised even Henry, who worked with a determination that Myrtle suspected had as much to do with his feelings for her as it did with any practical need to see the project finished before spring thaw made other work more pressing. He built it with 3 large windows facing south and east, positioned to catch the maximum light throughout the day, and a proper door that connected to the main cabin, wide enough that the loom could be moved through it without difficulty. He built shelves along one wall for her thread and finished cloth, and even fashioned a small stove of stacked stone in one corner so that she would never have to work in the cold. "It's beautiful," Myrtle said, the day he finally declared it finished, standing in the middle of the empty room with tears pricking at her eyes. "Henry, I don't know how to thank you for this." "You don't need to thank me," Henry said, though he looked pleased at her reaction, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth that Myrtle had come to treasure whenever she managed to draw it out of him. "Just fill it with your work. That'll be thanks enough." Moving the loom into its new home took the better part of an afternoon, both of them straining and laughing as they maneuvered the heavy frame through the doorway. And when it was finally settled in its place by the largest window, Myrtle stood back to admire how the afternoon light caught the wood, how the whole room seemed to have been built specifically to hold this one precious thing that connected her to her mother. "It's perfect," she said, turning to Henry with an expression of such open joy that he seemed momentarily struck speechless. "I'm glad," he managed finally. "I wanted you to have something that was truly yours out here, something that felt like home." "It does," Myrtle said. "It feels more like home than I thought possible, this far from everything I used to know." That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains and cast the new weaving room in shades of gold and amber, Myrtle sat at her loom for the first time in its proper place, and Henry sat nearby in a chair he had brought in specifically for the purpose of watching her work, and neither of them spoke for a long while, content simply to exist in each other's company as the light faded slowly around them. It was Henry who finally broke the silence, his voice quiet in the dimming room. "Myrtle," he said, and she looked up from her work, struck by the seriousness in his tone. I know it's not been so long since your mother passed, and I don't want to rush you into anything you're not ready for. But I find myself thinking about you at all hours of the day, and I don't know what to do with feelings like that except to tell you about them, plain and simple." Myrtle set down her shuttle, her heart hammering in her chest. "Henry, I feel the same way. I have for weeks now, though I've been afraid to admit it, afraid it was too soon, or that you might not feel the same." "I feel the same," Henry said, rising from his chair to cross the small room to where she sat. He knelt beside the loom, bringing himself to her eye level, and reached up to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, his rough fingers surprisingly tender against her skin. "I've never felt anything like this before, Myrtle. Not for any woman." "Neither have I," Myrtle whispered. And then, before either of them could second-guess the moment, Henry leaned forward and kissed her, gently at first, and then with more certainty as she responded, her hands coming up to rest against the solid strength of his chest. When they finally parted, both of them slightly breathless, Henry rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want you to think I built you this room expecting anything in return," he said. "I did it because I wanted to see you happy, wanted to give you something of your own out here." "I know that," Myrtle said. "That's part of why I've fallen for you, Henry Bass. Because you give without expecting, because you're the kindest man I've ever known, for all your size and strength." "And I've fallen for you," Henry said, "because you've brought life back into this cabin that's been quiet as a tomb since my mother passed. Because watching you work that loom, hearing you laugh, seeing you find your place here, it's made me remember what it feels like to hope for something." They sat together in the fading light for a long while after that, talking softly of small things and large ones, of Myrtle's memories of Missouri and Henry's memories of growing up in these mountains, of dreams neither of them had quite dared to voice before that evening. And when Myrtle finally retired to her room that night, it was with a lightness in her heart that she had not felt since long before her mother's passing, a sense that perhaps, against all odds and expectations, she had found not just a place to weave, but a place to belong. The weeks that followed passed in a haze of contentment that Myrtle had never expected to find so far from everything familiar. Henry courted her properly, in the manner the times demanded, taking her into town on Sundays for church services, where the townsfolk began to whisper approvingly about the match between the mountain man and the weaver girl who had come to their town under such sorrowful circumstances only to find happiness in the end. Constance Ridley, upon learning of the courtship, declared herself entirely unsurprised. "I saw it coming the very day he brought you into my shop," she told Myrtle with a knowing smile. "Henry Bass has never looked at a woman the way he looks at you, not since I've known him, and I've known him since he was a boy running wild in these hills." Myrtle's work at the loom flourished in her new space, and word began to spread through Larkspur Hollow and the surrounding ranches of the fine woolen blankets and cloth being produced by the young widow's cousin, who had settled with Henry Bass up the mountain. Orders came in steadily, enough that Myrtle found herself needing to plan her time carefully to keep pace with demand, and the small income she earned gave her a sense of independence and purpose that she treasured even as her feelings for Henry deepened. It was in early March, as the first hints of spring began to soften the harsh edges of winter, that Henry took Myrtle on a ride up to a high meadow overlooking the valley, a place he told her held special meaning for him. "My mother used to bring me here when I was young," he said, as they sat together on a fallen log, looking out over the vast expanse of mountains and valleys stretching toward the horizon. "She said it was the one place she could see clear to forever, and forever always looked kinder from up here than it did from down in the valley." "It's beautiful," Myrtle said, and found the word inadequate for the sight before her, the mountains still capped with snow but the valleys below beginning to show hints of green, the whole world seeming to hold its breath before the full arrival of spring. Henry reached into his coat then, and Myrtle felt her heart begin to race as he withdrew a small object wrapped in a piece of soft leather. "I made this myself," he said, unwrapping it to reveal a simple ring carved from a piece of smooth, pale wood, polished until it gleamed. I know it's not gold or silver, not what you might have expected for something like this, but I wanted to make something with my own hands, the way your mother made things with hers at that loom. Henry, Myrtle breathed, tears already gathering in her eyes. Myrtle Carter, Henry said, turning to face her fully, his large hands trembling slightly as he held out the ring. I've never been a man of many words, and I don't know that I'll ever be good at saying the things I feel the way a poem might say them. But I know that since you came into my life, everything's felt right in a way it hadn't been since my mother passed. I know that I want to spend the rest of my days building a life with you, filling that cabin with more than just the sound of your loom, though I'll never tire of that sound either. Will you marry me? Myrtle could barely speak through her tears, but she managed a nod, and then the words followed, tumbling out in a rush of joy and disbelief. Yes, Henry. Yes, of course I'll marry you. I love you more than I ever thought I could love anyone again after losing my mother. Henry slipped the wooden ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as though he had somehow known the exact size of her without ever having to ask, and then he pulled her into an embrace so full of tenderness and joy that Myrtle felt she might burst from the sheer happiness of it. They were married 3 weeks later, in the small white church with the leaning steeple, with what seemed like the entire town of Larkspur Hollow in attendance. Constance Ridley had insisted on helping Myrtle sew her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of pale blue wool that Myrtle herself had woven for the occasion, and Mrs. Prude had provided flowers from her own small greenhouse, early crocuses and forced daffodils that added splashes of color to the otherwise austere church. Henry stood at the altar in a suit that had clearly been tailored for the occasion, looking almost uncomfortable in the formal clothing, but unable to hide the joy radiating from his face as Myrtle walked down the aisle toward him. The preacher, an elderly man named Reverend Coates who had served the town for over 20 years, spoke of love found in unexpected places, of grief transformed into hope, and of the particular blessing of two lonely hearts finding each other in a land that could be as harsh as it was beautiful. When they exchanged their vows, Henry's voice was steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. I promise to build you a life as sturdy and true as any cabin I've ever raised, he said, to give you a home where you'll always have light to work by and warmth to keep you comfortable, and love enough to fill whatever empty spaces grief has left in your heart. Myrtle, in turn, promised to weave their life together with the same care and devotion her mother had taught her to bring to every thread, to make their home a place of beauty and comfort, and to love him with everything she had, for as long as they both should live. The reception that followed was a simple affair held in the town hall, with food brought by nearly every family in Larkspur Hollow, and music provided by a fiddler and a man who played passable tunes on an old accordion. Myrtle danced with Henry until her feet ached, marveling at how gently such a large man could move despite his size, and how completely at ease she felt in his arms despite the whirlwind nature of their courtship. 6 months ago, she said to him during a quiet moment away from the celebration, I was burying my mother and wondering if I'd ever feel happy again. I never could have imagined this. Life has a way of surprising us, Henry said, pulling her close. I never thought I'd find someone who could make this mountain feel like more than just a place to survive. You've given me a reason to look forward to each day, Myrtle. I hope I can give you the same. You already have, Myrtle said, and kissed him there in the corner of the town hall, uncaring of who might see, too full of happiness to worry about propriety. Their life together in the following months settled into a rhythm that felt both new and deeply comfortable, as though they had been building toward this partnership their entire lives without knowing it. Myrtle's weaving business continued to grow, and she began taking on more ambitious projects, weaving elaborate patterns that drew attention even from ranchers as far as 50 miles distant, who sent word requesting blankets bearing patterns she had developed herself, inspired by the mountains and valleys she now called home. Henry, for his part, continued his work timbering and building, but found himself increasingly in demand for construction projects around town as word spread of his skill, and the additional income allowed them to expand the cabin further, adding a proper kitchen, and eventually, as their family began to grow, additional rooms to accommodate the children who would come to fill their home with laughter and noise. Their first child arrived just over a year after their wedding, a son they named Thomas after Henry's father's father, a man Henry had never known but whose stories, passed down through his mother, had always struck Henry as representing a kind of steady goodness he hoped to embody himself. Thomas was born on a spring morning much like the one when Myrtle had first arrived in Larkspur Hollow, and Henry, holding his son for the first time, wept openly with a joy that surprised even himself, a man who had spent so many years believing himself destined for solitude. "He's got your eyes," Myrtle said, exhausted but glowing with happiness as she watched Henry cradle their newborn son with a tenderness that seemed almost impossible given the sheer size of his hands compared to the tiny infant. "And your stubbornness, I'd wager," Henry said, though his voice was thick with emotion, "already fighting me on being swaddled properly." The years that followed brought further blessings. A daughter, Eleanor, named for Henry's mother, arrived 2 years after Thomas, followed by a second son, William, 3 years later. Myrtle's weaving room, once built for a single loom and a solitary woman's grief, grew to accommodate a second, smaller loom that she began teaching Eleanor to use as the girl grew old enough to show interest in her grandmother's craft, a craft that had traveled from Kentucky to Missouri to the Wyoming mountains, and now would continue into yet another generation. The town of Larkspur Hollow grew alongside their family, as more settlers arrived drawn by the promise of the railroad that eventually extended a spur line toward the mining operations further up in the mountains, and Henry's skills as a builder remained in constant demand. He built the town's new schoolhouse, its expanded church, and numerous homes for families who arrived seeking the same opportunities that had drawn Myrtle west so many years before. Despite the growth and change around them, Henry and Myrtle's love for each other only deepened with time, tempered by the shared trials of raising children, weathering harsh winters, and building a life together from the raw materials of grief and hope that had first brought them together. Myrtle often thought, in quiet moments at her loom while listening to her children play in the yard and Henry's axe ringing out from somewhere in the timber, that her mother would have been proud of the life she had built, would have recognized in Henry the kind of steady, generous love that had defined her own marriage before illness had taken her too soon. One evening, nearly 10 years after her arrival in Larkspur Hollow, Myrtle sat at her loom working on a particularly intricate pattern intended as a wedding gift for Eleanor, who at 17 had recently become engaged to a young rancher named Jacob Whitfield, a match that had grown from childhood friendship into something deeper over the past year. Henry entered the weaving room quietly, as he often did, to simply sit and watch her work, a habit that had persisted throughout their marriage and that Myrtle had come to treasure as one of the quiet constants of their life together. "You're thinking of your mother," Henry observed, settling into the chair that had sat in that same corner since the room's construction, worn now with years of use. "Always when I weave something for a wedding," Myrtle admitted. "She would have loved Eleanor, I think, would have taught her things I've forgotten to teach, patterns from her own mother that I never quite mastered." "Eleanor's learned plenty from you," Henry said. "I watched her working at her loom just this morning, and I swear for a moment I thought I was seeing you at 17, though I never knew you then." Myrtle smiled, setting down her shuttle to look at her husband properly, taking in the way the years had treated him kindly despite the hard labor that filled his days. His hair, still long enough to brush his collar, had begun to show streaks of gray at the temples, and lines had formed around his eyes from years of squinting into mountain sunlight. but he remained as strong and capable as the day she had first seen him striding into Mrs. Prute's mercantile, and his eyes still held the same tenderness whenever he looked at her that had first captured her heart all those years ago. "Do you ever regret it?" Myrtle asked suddenly, a question that had occasionally crossed her mind over the years but that she had never quite voiced aloud. Taking in a stranger that first winter, building her a room, giving up so much of your solitary life for a family you never expected to have. Henry looked at her with genuine surprise, as though the question had never once occurred to him as something worth considering. "Myrtle Carter Bass," he said, using her full married name with deliberate emphasis. "The day I brought you up this mountain was the luckiest day of my entire life. I trade every quiet, lonely year I lived before you arrived for one more day with you and our children, without a moment's hesitation." "I feel the same," Myrtle said, her eyes glistening with unshed tears despite the happiness of the moment. "Though I sometimes think about that woman who arrived here that winter, grieving and alone, with nothing but a loom and a trunk of clothes, and I wonder if she could have ever imagined the life waiting for her." "I like to think," Henry said, rising from his chair to cross the room and kneel beside her at the loom, much as he had done that first evening he had confessed his feelings, that some part of her already knew, even then, that she'd found exactly where she was meant to be. Their daughter Eleanor's wedding took place that autumn, in the same small white church where Myrtle and Henry had exchanged their own vows, and Myrtle wept with happiness as she watched her daughter walk down the aisle in a dress woven from cloth that Myrtle herself had created, a design that incorporated patterns from both her mother's traditions and new elements she had developed during her years in the mountains, a fitting symbol of the way old traditions could grow and flourish in new soil when tended with love. As the years continued to unfold, Thomas grew into a young man who inherited his father's skill with timber and construction, eventually taking over much of Henry's building work, as Henry himself began to slow slightly with age, though he remained vigorous and strong well into his later years, still capable of splitting wood and hauling timber, long after many men his age had retired to easier pursuits. William, their youngest, showed an unexpected talent for numbers, and eventually took on the role of managing the town's growing commercial interests, including the sale of Myrtle's increasingly renowned woven goods, which by then were being shipped as far as Denver, and even, on occasion, to buyers back east who had heard of the quality of frontier wool cloth coming out of the Wyoming mountains. Myrtle's weaving room, expanded twice over the years to accommodate additional looms and the growing needs of what had become something of a small family enterprise, remained the heart of their home, the place where Myrtle spent her happiest hours, surrounded by the tools of her mother's trade, and increasingly, by grandchildren who came to watch and learn as Eleanor's own children grew old enough to show interest in the family craft. Grief, Myrtle had learned over the years, did not simply disappear with time, but rather transformed itself, softened at its edges, became something that could be carried alongside joy rather than existing in opposition to it. She still thought of her mother often, especially in the quiet hours at her loom, but the pain of that loss had long since given way to gratitude, for she understood now that her mother's death, tragic as it had been, had set in motion the journey that led her to Henry, to this mountain, to this life that exceeded anything she could have imagined for herself in those dark days following her mother's funeral. On the evening of their 25th wedding anniversary, Henry and Myrtle sat together on the porch of the home he had built for her, now surrounded by additional structures that housed their grown children's families, who had settled nearby in a small cluster of homes that had come to be known locally as Bass Hollow, a fitting tribute to the family that had grown from a single act of kindness so many years before. 25 years, Myrtle said, leaning her head against Henry's shoulder as they watched the sun set behind the mountains that had witnessed their entire life together. "I never could have imagined that first day I stepped off the coach that I'd end up here with you with all of this." "Neither could I," Henry admitted, his arm wrapped securely around her shoulders, his strength undiminished despite the years, though his hair had gone fully gray now, still long and still, Myrtle thought, remarkably handsome on him. I remember thinking, watching you sitting there in Mrs. Pruitt's store, so lost and grieving, that I'd never seen anyone who looked more like they needed someone in their corner. I didn't know then that I was the one who needed you, needed the life you'd bring with you. You gave me a room to weave in, Myrtle said softly, but you gave me so much more than that. You gave me a family, a home, a reason to believe that happiness could survive even the deepest grief. And you gave me the same, Henry said, turning to press a kiss to her temple. You wove us a life, Myrtle, thread by thread, year by year. I don't think either of us could have built what we have alone. They sat together as the stars began to emerge over the mountains, the same mountains that had witnessed Henry's birth, his mother's death, his solitary years of building and surviving, and then the arrival of a grieving young woman with nothing but a loom and a broken heart. Those same mountains had witnessed their courtship, their marriage, the birth of their children, and now stood as silent witness to a love that had only grown stronger through 25 years of shared life, shared labor, and shared devotion. Inside the house, in the weaving room that had started it all, Myrtle's original loom still stood in its place of honor by the largest window, though it had long since been joined by newer looms for their children and grandchildren to learn upon. The wood had darkened slightly with age, worn smooth in places from decades of use, but it remained as sturdy and functional as the day Henry had first helped her assemble it, a testament to craftsmanship that spanned generations, from her mother's hands in Kentucky to her own hands in Wyoming, and now, increasingly, to the hands of her children and grandchildren who continued the tradition she had carried west so many years before. I have something to show you, Henry said suddenly, rising from his seat on the porch and offering his hand to help Myrtle to her feet. Something I've been working on, when you thought I was simply out checking on the timber lot. He led her around to the side of the house, to a small addition she had not noticed being built, tucked discreetly behind the main structure of their home. Henry pushed open the door to reveal a small room, empty except for a single object standing in the center, catching the last light of the setting sun through a window positioned exactly as the weaving room's windows had been positioned all those years before. It was a small loom, beautifully carved, clearly built by Henry's own skilled hands, though the design incorporated details that spoke of careful study of Myrtle's own equipment. I wanted to build something for our first grandchild, Henry explained, watching Myrtle's face carefully for her reaction. Eleanor mentioned that her daughter, little Rose, has been asking to learn the loom, and I thought, well, every weaver in this family has started with her own proper space to work in. Seemed only right that Rose should have the same. Myrtle felt tears rising as she ran her hands over the smooth wood of the small loom, recognizing in its careful construction the same devotion that had built her own weaving room all those years ago. Henry Bass, she said, her voice thick with emotion, you continue to surprise me, even after 25 years. I hope I never stop, Henry said, pulling her into an embrace. I hope I spend every remaining year of my life finding new ways to show you how much you mean to me, Myrtle. You gave this old mountain man a reason to build more than just cabins and barns. You gave me a family, a legacy, a love that I never thought I deserved but that I'll spend the rest of my days grateful for. They stood together in that small room, built with the same care and love that had characterized every structure Henry had ever raised, and Myrtle thought of the long journey that had brought her here, from a grief-stricken young woman arriving in a strange town with nothing but her mother's loom, to a wife, mother, and now grandmother, surrounded by a family and a home built on foundations of love, resilience, and the enduring power of craft passed down through generations. Outside, the mountains stood eternal and unchanging, the same peaks that had watched over Henry's solitary years and now watched over the family he had built with Myrtle. a family that would continue to grow and flourish in the years to come, weaving its own story into the fabric of this rugged, beautiful land they had both come to call home. As darkness fell fully over Larkspur Hollow that evening, and the first stars began to twinkle above the mountain peaks, Henry and Myrtle Bass walked back to their house hand in hand, past the weaving room where a lifetime of craft and love had been created, toward the warm lights of home where their children and grandchildren waited, secure in the knowledge that whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together. As they had faced everything since that fateful winter day when a mountain man's kindness had given a grieving young weaver not just a room to work in, but a home, a family, and a love that would last a lifetime. In the years that followed, their story became something of a local legend in Larkspur Hollow, told to new arrivals as an example of the particular kind of grace that could be found even in the harshest circumstances, of how a chance encounter between two grieving souls could grow into a love story that would outlast them both, carried forward through their children and grandchildren, through the continuing craft of weaving that Myrtle had brought west with her mother's loom, and through the sturdy, well-built structures that Henry's skilled hands continued to raise throughout the growing town, each one a testament to a love built to last, thread by thread, log by log, day by day until it had become as much a part of the landscape as the mountains themselves. And when, many years later, both Henry and Myrtle had grown old together, surrounded by children and grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren who had heard the story of their meeting told and retold countless times around family gatherings, they would sit together on that same porch where they had spent so many evenings, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, and they would think, without needing to say it aloud, that whatever grief had brought them to this place, whatever loss had set them each on their separate paths toward that fateful meeting in Mrs. Pruitt's Mercantile, it had led them in the end to exactly where they were always meant to be. Myrtle would sometimes take out her mother's original shuttle, worn smooth from decades of use, and run her fingers over its familiar shape, thinking of the long journey it had made from Kentucky to Missouri to Wyoming, thinking of her mother's hands that had once guided it through countless threads, and thinking too of her own hands, now marked with the same kind of gentle wear, that had carried on that tradition in this unexpected corner of the world. And Henry, watching her in these quiet moments, would feel the same swell of love and gratitude that had first overwhelmed him all those years ago, watching a grieving stranger transform his solitary cabin into a home filled with warmth, purpose, and an abundance of love that he had never dared to imagine for himself. Their love, forged in grief and built through patient kindness, had proven itself sturdy enough to weather every storm the years had brought, strong enough to support not just the two of them, but an entire family that continued to grow and flourish in the shadow of the Bighorn Mountains, a living testament to the truth that sometimes the greatest loves are built not from grand gestures, but from simple acts of kindness, from a room built with careful hands for a woman with nowhere else to go, and from two hearts brave enough to trust each other with their deepest grief and their most tender hopes, weaving together, thread by thread, a life more beautiful than either of them could have imagined alone. And so it was that Myrtle Carter, who had arrived in Larkspur Hollow with nothing but her late mother's loom and a heart heavy with grief, found in Henry Bass not just shelter from a harsh winter, but a partner for life, a man whose strength was matched only by his tenderness, and whose simple act of building her a proper room to weave in had, in the end, built them both a home, a family, and a love story that would be remembered in that small mountain town for generations to come. Long after the two of them had passed peacefully in their old age, within the same year of each other, buried side by side in the small cemetery behind the church where they had exchanged their vows, their headstones facing the mountains that had witnessed every chapter of their remarkable life together, forever united in death as they had been in life, Two souls who had found in each other exactly what they never knew they were searching for.